Okay everyone, welcome back to the Art of War. This is the second in a series of videos that I'm recording. I'm using game theory to study 4 key battles in modern history. My name is Dr. Jeffrey Pollock and my PhD is on engineering topics, but engineering using a science which is more proper to economics, a mathematics which is more proper to economics called game theory. So let's jump in and we'll see how it works. Well, last time we talked about an interesting set of topics which revolved around an arms race. So an arms race, as you know, is a competition between two nations to try to produce materials for their militaries at an increasing rate. So one nation anticipates the production of the other nation, and then the other nation anticipates their production, and basically there's this race of trying to build more and more. And we saw how that can be modeled using the type of mathematics which is known as game theory. So game theory allows you to study that situation, and we talked about the terms Nash equilibrium, best response, which we'll review in a bit here. But today we're going to be talking about not a general conflict such as an arms race, but a specific battle which occurred in World War II known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. And so we're going to go through some of the background and the mathematical modeling of that conflict, that battle in the Pacific theater. And we'll see that this is a battle model which was proposed by the soldier and also scholar O.G. Haywood. So there's an actual paper and you can read it. And I'll give you a little summary in this talk. So last time, as I said, we studied an arms race using game theory, this mathematics of strategic decision making. And two terms that we focused on last time, one is best response. And the idea here is that a best response is the optimal strategy of player A against player B's strategy, right? And in the arms race, this was very simple. It was, if player B spends $3 million on military expenses, the best thing for me is to spend a little bit more, like we said 10% more. So, $3,300,000 on military expenses, right? And then the thing is that the other player is also computing a best response, right? So player B is also responding to player A. So if he sees player A invest $3,300,000, then he invests 10% more. And so if you look at this figure on the right, that cascading update, that cascading best response would tend to increase the amount of money spent more and more and just sort of ad infinitum, right? Or until a whole budget was spent without any other factors. And so that movement of the best response is called best response dynamics, which is actually a fairly advanced concept in game theory. Now, another important thing is a Nash equilibrium. And we said that a Nash equilibrium is the point at which all of the players are playing best responses. They're best responding to each other. So you could think at that point, basically, there would be no more movement. And so in this arms race, we asked whether there is any point at which everyone is playing best response. Is there any Nash equilibrium? And in fact, we said that there is one, which is 0. Right? So if another player invests $0 and I want to invest 10% more than 0, well, that's actually still 0 and vice versa. So that is a Nash equilibrium, but the problem is that the dynamics of the best response move away from that. And so we said that there is this issue because you can never get to that sort of perfect point. And obviously, yeah, we see that there was this Cold War arms race going on. Well, the good thing about these videos, this Art of War series, is that they're designed to be standalone. So you don't have to be familiar with the previous video, although I advise you to check it out if you want to learn about this one. This one is going to be, as I said, about a specific battle, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. This battle took place in the Pacific theater of World War II. So if you look at this map here, take note of Japan in the northern part of the map. And then look down towards the Philippines and a little bit east, and you'll see New Guinea, right? This island off of Australia. So here's New Guinea, and there were a lot of island battles in the Pacific theater that happened right around this area. Take a look at the island to the northeast of New Guinea. And here you can see that that island is called New Britain. So this island, New Britain, is the kind of epicenter of the battle that we're going to be studying here. So what happened is that Japan had a force of about 6,900 troops on the northeastern tip of the island. So that was a concentration of Japanese troops, and meanwhile, there was a heated battle underway on New Guinea itself. You can see here that the Japanese forces are in red. The Allied, meaning both Australian and North American forces, were sort of to the southeast in blue. In December of 1942, the Japanese Imperial General Headquarters ordered the force on New Britain to reinforce this army in New Guinea. So they wanted to get these 6,900 soldiers onto New Guinea. And the safest way would have been to march along the island of New Britain and then make a short transit, a short sea voyage across the gap into New Guinea. But the problem is that New Britain was basically swamp and other landmass that was difficult to pass through. And so the Japanese decided to sail, that is, to take off from the northeastern coast of New Britain and to go by ship to New Guinea. Now, the issue was that the Allies had massive amounts of air power in their stronghold on New Guinea. And at that time, Allies in Australia and also in Washington, D.C., decrypted and translated a message with the Japanese convoy's intended destination and arrival date. So they are able to decrypt this message, and they realized the exact day that the Japanese were going to depart and intended to arrive. Now, the interesting thing is they didn't know which route the Japanese would take. So there were two possible routes, right? One was around the north side of the island, and the second one was around the south side. Now, the Japanese knew that either way they went, they were likely to come under bombing runs from American fighters. And so Japan amassed this force, right, of 8 destroyers, ships, 100 fighter aircraft, and of course the 8 troop transports that were carrying the almost 7,000 troops, right? So 100 fighter aircraft, 8 destroyers, and it's hard to imagine kind of the magnitude of this force. And yet the Allies had a much superior force. They had 120 bombers, 54 fighters, and 10 torpedo boats. And they had recently modified the technology on some of these bombers to give them more ability to take out Japanese ships. And so they had superior technology and enough firepower to do a huge amount of damage on that troop transport convoy as it was going to New Guinea. Now, the Japanese transport was going to take about 4 days. Actually, in reality, it was about 3, but the mathematics work out slightly better if you use 4. It's slightly more clear. So if you go in the actual paper by O.G. Haywood, you'll see it was going to take 3, but I'm going to say it was going to take 4 because it'll make the math slightly more clear. So the Allies decide to send out recon planes to see which way the Japanese are going, right? Because they've got to see if they should attack north or south of the island. But the problem is it's going to take those planes some of the 4 days, some of the 4-day transit to get there. And obviously, if the planes fly to the wrong side, it's going to take them longer to realize we're on the wrong side. And, you know, the Japanese might get almost to their destination before the Allies could bomb them. And so the Allies consider 2 different plans. Basically, they decide that they're not going to send all the planes in one direction, but they'll send a majority of planes north or a majority of planes south. So here in this diagram, this is intended to represent the Allies sending a majority of reconnaissance planes north. And here they send a majority of reconnaissance planes south, and of course, just a few north. Now, there is one more factor here which played a key role, and that was that north of New Britain, it was known that there tended to be a lot of rainy, a lot of cloudy, stormy weather. And that actually played to the advantage of any ships which were trying to escape being bombed, because the cloud cover would tend to make it more difficult for bombers to see the ships, and the sea apparently wasn't bad enough to obstruct the actual flow of the ships, but the visibility would be worse in the north, and that was actually critical. So if the Japanese sailed north, it would take the Allies longer to find them. But of course, the thing is, if the Allies know that, then there's some question of, well, okay, should Japan just sail south? So what do you think? Should Japan sail north or south? And should the Allies send the majority of reconnaissance planes north or south? Well, let's set up a table to get a few numbers out here. So we have this table, and the Allied strategy is on the left side of the table. In other words, the Allies choose the row of the table. So the Allies could choose to send the majority of fighter planes north, which is the first row of the table, or south, which is the second. The Japanese choose the column of the table. So the Japanese could either send their convoy north, which is the left column, or south, which is the right column. So now we're going to try to put numbers in this chart, which is actually what the American general did in assessing this situation. So let's start with the best situation for the Americans. Which of these four quadrants do you think would be the best situation for the Americans? Well, it would be this south-south scenario, right? Because as you see in the diagram to the left, in the south-south scenario, the Japanese go south, the Allied forces also go south, there are clear skies, and there are plenty of planes to observe them. And in that case, they would get almost the full 4 days of bombing, right? So that was the best for the Allies, the worst for the Japanese. What do you think would be the second best scenario for the Americans and Australians? Well, this one is not as obvious, but it turns out that if the Allies sent the majority of planes north and only a few south, they would still get a full 3 days of bombing, because the clear skies would still allow that one plane to discover the Japanese convoy. Now, they would lose a day, right? If they sent the majority of planes that way, they would get 4 days of bombing. But since they only sent one plane that way, it would take longer to detect the convoy, and they would only get in 3 days of bombing. Now, the next best for the Americans would be if the Japanese went north and the Americans correctly guessed north, but due to this cloud cover, it was still somewhat difficult to detect the convoy. So this would result in 2 days of bombing. And finally, the worst situation for the Allies, the best for the Japanese, would be if the Japanese ships went north, the Americans, for the most part, went south, and they only had a few planes to discover a convoy which was in the midst of clouds and obscured due to the weather. So this is the chart we have, right? 4 days of bombing, 3 days of bombing, 2 or 1. And obviously the objective here for the Allies is to maximize the number of days of bombing the convoy with the troops being transported. And for the Japanese, the objective is to minimize that number. So the question is, where should the Japanese sail and where should the Americans fly? Well, game theory wasn't around at the time of this battle. It didn't really start getting going in full swing until the next 10 years or 15 years. But later, there was a soldier and a scholar, as I mentioned, named O.J. Haywood Jr., who investigated this battle using game theory. And basically, he said that if this works well for this particular battle, couldn't we use game theory to study other and to devise strategies for other battles? Okay, so let's look at one particular quadrant here of this interaction. Let's say that we have a scenario in which the Japanese send the convoy to the south of New Britain, and the Americans guess right, and they fly to the south. right? This is the best strategy, as we said, the best outcome, rather, for the Allies. They get 4 full days of bombing. Okay, now starting from this, we want to look at, as I said, best responses. So let's look at the Japanese scenario. Here they're doing very, very badly. They get bombed for 4 days. And so there's a question of whether they can do better. Well, currently the Allies are sending their planes south. What is the Japanese best response to south? Well, that's pretty obvious, right? If the planes go south, the best thing for the Japanese is to go north. So we represent that in this diagram with an arrow showing that we move from the bottom right to the bottom left-hand side of this matrix. So if the Japanese fly north instead and the Americans sail south, the Japanese do very well. They only get bombed for 1 day. So now the question is whether the Allies can better respond to that. So again, if we fix Japan's strategy at north, and we look in that left-hand column of the matrix, we can see what the best strategy for the Allies is. And that is, of course, to best respond with north. By doing that, the Allies get 2 days rather than 1 day of bombing. Okay, and now we can again go back to the Japanese. So if the Allies are sending planes north, what's the best strategy for the Japanese? Well, maybe I got you. Actually, it's still to go north, right? Because again, fix the Allied strategy at north. So take the top row of that matrix. And you see that if the Japanese were to deviate, that's a technical term, deviate and go south, they would get bombed for 3 days, but as it is, they only get bombed for 2. And so what that means is that we have a Nash equilibrium at this north-north quadrant. So we can check that, right? We can check and make sure that this is a mutual best response. So again, fix that quadrant. The Japanese are minimizers, right? Because they're trying to minimize the number in the matrix, the number of days bombed. And you recognize that if they were to play south instead, they would get a higher number, 3. So currently they are playing a minimizing strategy against the top row chosen by the Allies. And we can now switch the perspective to the Allied decision. So if the Japanese pick north, that is, if they are sailing north, if they're choosing the left-hand column of the matrix, the best the Allies can do is what they're currently doing, 2. If they deviate and go south, they would only get 1 day of bombing. And so this is a Nash equilibrium. And in fact, this is what actually happened. In the real historical battle, the Japanese went north under cloud cover. The Americans and Australians sent the majority of their reconnaissance planes north. It took them about a day because of the cloud cover, and then they spotted the fleet. They still had several planes up there, right? And the Allies got in 2 full days of bombing. You can see the kind of route of the transports here and the flight paths of some of the planes. And this was a disaster for Japan. The Allies sunk all 8 troop transports, and they sank 4 of the escorting destroyers. So out of the 6,900 troops that the Japanese needed in New Guinea for this ongoing land battle, only about 1,200 made it. Now, actually, it turns out that about 3,000 were actually rescued by the other destroyers. They made it back to New Britain, but Japanese never sent them back to New Guinea, and eventually the Allies were able to basically take over to win the campaign in New Guinea. Okay, so the Nash equilibrium here was relatively easy, right? We just had to take 2 kind of steps to figure it out. But what if the conditions were slightly different? For instance, here the thing that made it pretty easy was that the clouds played such a big role. So it was rather obvious that the best thing for Japan to do was to sail under the clouds, even if the Allies went there. But what if the clouds didn't matter so much, and the really important thing was whether the Allies guessed the correct direction? Well, we can model that by just slightly changing the numbers in the matrix. So here we switched the 3 and the 2 in the top row. And again, this is saying, what if the conditions were slightly different? Clouds didn't matter so much. And the important thing was that the Allies guessed the correct direction. So you could step through and see why those numbers make sense for that. But the interesting thing is that here, there is no Nash equilibrium. Well, there is no pure strategy Nash equilibrium. So we've been talking about pure strategy Nash equilibrium the whole time. Let me explain a little bit more. Again, let's consider starting from that number 4 slot, the bottom right. Well, here, as we said, the Allies are choosing the bottom row of the table. And it's better for the Japanese to choose the left column of the bottom row, right? They're a minimizing player, and 1 day of bombing is better than 4 days of bombing. But then we said that if Japan is playing north, the best response for the Allies isn't south, it's north, so that they get 3 days of bombing instead of 1. Okay, so now we're in the north-north strategy profile. But here, if the Allies are choosing the top row, the best response for the Japanese is to choose the right-hand column, south. So then they get only 2 days of bombing instead of 3. Okay, but now if we're in this top right quadrant, are the Allies doing as good as they could? Well, no, actually, they could respond to the right column with the bottom row, and they would get 4 days of bombing. But now, as you see, the cycle continues, right? And so there is this best response cycle that goes all the way around the matrix repeatedly. And so there is no point at which both countries are best responding to each other. And this is a situation in which you have no pure strategy Nash equilibrium. So it's not completely clear what each country should do. Now, it turns out that there is an answer to this. It involves a concept called mixed strategies. Mixed strategies are a technique whereby a player plays different actions with some probability, with some randomness involved. So it involves a little bit more math, and that'll be a topic for next time. Thank you for joining me, and again, check out the YouTube channel. You can check out the first lesson. This was the second, and we'll see you back here for more Art of War using game theory to study key conflicts in military history.